In 1845, New Orleans, a sealed court ledger recorded something that was never meant to be spoken aloud. Not an affair, not a scandal whispered behind fans at church, but a marriage legally witnessed, deliberately hidden, and violently erased. A wealthy widow, an enslaved gardener, and a union that threatened inheritance laws, racial hierarchy, and the illusion that power always flows in one direction. What her family did to destroy this marriage would haunt the city long after both lovers were gone. And the question remains, if love was impossible under slavery, why did they try so desperately to bury proof that it existed? In 1845, New Orleans existed in a state of permanent contradiction, a city where iron balconies overflowed with flowers while human lives were traded less than a mile away, where Catholic bells rang each morning over streets that carried the quiet weight of bondage, and where wealth insulated sin so completely that cruelty could wear lace and still be called respectable. Marguerite Duval had been born into this world knowing its rules long before she learned its prayers. She was raised to understand that a woman's power was permitted only when it flowed through men, first a father, then a husband, then, if fortune allowed, a son, and that anything outside this chain was considered dangerous, unnatural, and quietly punishable. When her husband died unexpectedly, taken by a fever that doctors described with elegant words but treated with useless remedies, Marguerite found herself in a position both rare and perilous. She was wealthy, childless, and legally autonomous. In theory, widowhood granted her authority over property, servants, and finances, but in practice, it placed her under constant observation, as if the city itself were waiting to see how she would misuse the freedom it never intended to give her. Her late husband's family watched her accounts, her own relatives monitored her church attendance, even her household staff understood that her behavior would be reported, filtered, and judged. It was during this period, when grief had stripped away her patience for performance, that Marguerite began walking the back garden each morning, not for leisure, but because it was the only place on her property where silence still felt honest. The garden sat behind the main house, separated from public view by thick hedges and old cypress trees, whose roots rose like bones from the damp soil. It was there that she first noticed Etienne not as an asset, but as a presence, a man whose posture betrayed awareness rather than submission, whose movements were efficient without being hurried, and whose eyes did not drop immediately when spoken to. According to estate records, he was listed simply as gardener, male, age unknown, purchased years earlier for his ability to manage, imported plants that repeatedly failed in Louisiana's unforgiving climate. What those records did not capture was the way he listened when Marguerite spoke, not with the practiced emptiness of obedience, but with attention sharpened by long restraint. Their first conversations were unremarkable on the surface, questions about soil drainage, about the wilting camellias, about which sections of the garden needed shade cloth, but something unsettled Marguerite almost immediately. Etienne answered with clarity, sometimes offering alternatives she had not considered, sometimes explaining cause and consequence with a precision that reminded her uncomfortably of the men who once debated politics at her husband's table. It was not attraction that disturbed her at first, but recognition. She realized, slowly and against her will, that she was speaking to someone who understood more than he was ever meant to reveal, and that frightened her more than ignorance ever could. Over the following weeks their conversations lengthened. Marguerite lingered. Etienne, careful but perceptive, began to speak only when necessary, but when he did, his words carried weight. He knew which plants had been imported from Saint-Domingue, which soils were ruined by overuse, which parts of the land would fail within a decade if managed carelessly. He spoke of seasons as if they were negotiations rather than inevitabilities, and Marguerite, who had spent her life being praised for silence and compliance, found herself asking questions she had never voiced aloud, not only about the garden, but about the laws that governed it, the boundaries that determined who could own land and who could never escape it. She did not intend to cross a line, she did not even see the line at first. What she felt was a slow erosion of certainty, a realization that the world she inherited depended on everyone pretending not to see what was directly in front of them. Etienne never asked for familiarity. He never sought permission to be more than what he was recorded as. Yet his very existence, fully aware and deliberately constrained, began to feel like an accusation. Marguerite's relatives noticed changes before they understood their cause. She dismissed a long-serving overseer without explanation. She reduced the frequency of dinner parties. She spent less time performing grief and more time reviewing account books herself. These were small rebellions, invisible to the law but alarming to those who depended on her predictability. The garden became her refuge, but also her exposure. Servants whispered. Eyes lingered longer than they should. Marguerite understood, perhaps too late, that independence was tolerated only so long as it did not challenge hierarchy, and hierarchy, she was beginning to realize, was far more fragile than it pretended to be. Etienne understood this before she did. He had survived long enough to know that visibility was a liability and attention a weapon. When Marguerite began asking questions about manumission laws, hypothetically, carefully, as though discussing whether, he answered without hope or bitterness. He explained which freedoms existed on paper and which vanished in practice. He never spoke of escape. He spoke of survival. That, more than anything, unsettled her, because Marguerite had always believed that kindness, applied correctly, could soften cruelty. Etienne knew better. What passed between them was not romance in its early form, but a shared awareness of danger, a recognition that something had already shifted and could not be returned to its original position. The city around them continued its routines, unaware or unwilling to notice the tension forming in a garden that was never meant to produce anything but flowers. And yet, within that enclosed space, the rules of ownership began to feel less absolute, less convincing. Marguerite did not yet imagine marriage. She did not yet imagine defiance. What she imagined, terrifyingly, was choice. And in 1845 New Orleans, choice, especially a woman's, was more threatening than rebellion. If this story already feels like it is moving towards something the world would never allow, you are right to feel that unease, because nothing that begins quietly in a place like this is permitted to end peacefully. If you want to understand how one widow's refusal to obey expectation ignited a chain of events powerful families spent decades trying to erase, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and stay with us. Because this is only the beginning, and the garden was just the first place where the rules began to fail. As the humid summer of 1845 settled over New Orleans, the garden ceased to be merely a refuge and became something far more dangerous, a place where the distance between thought and action narrowed until even silence felt like a decision. Marguerite Duval began to notice that the city watched widows the way it watched fires, with fascination, caution, and the readiness to intervene if the flames spread too far. Invitations arrived framed as kindness and carried the weight of inspection. Priests called more frequently. Cousins lingered after services with questions that pretended to be concern. The expectation was clear. Grief should end in reintegration, autonomy in remarriage, and independence in obedience to a male guardian who would restore order. Marguerite answered with courtesy and delay, which in New Orleans society was read not as neutrality but as provocation. The garden, meanwhile, grew lush under Etienne's care, its symmetry masking the quiet rebellion beneath its surface. Their conversations evolved not by intention but by necessity. Marguerite began asking for explanations not just of soil and season, but of contracts and codes, of the ways people were categorized and constrained by ink on paper. Etienne spoke carefully, as someone long accustomed to weighing words against consequences, but his answers grew more precise, less guarded. He explained how Spanish and French legal traditions overlapped uneasily with American statutes, how manumission could be promised and revoked, how marriages conducted beyond local jurisdiction might be recognized elsewhere, yet erased at home. He never suggested solutions, he described landscapes. Marguerite listened, not as a woman seeking escape, but as one recognizing the architecture of her cage for the first time. It was during this period that she noticed the shift in her household, the way servants avoided the garden path when she walked it, the way notes from her lawyer grew firmer in tone, the way her late husband's brother, Lucien, began appearing unannounced under the guise of managing family interests. Lucien's visits were brief but pointed, his gaze lingering too long on Marguerite's ledgers, his questions circling the same themes of propriety and legacy. He spoke often of her duty to preserve the Duval name, to consider the optics of her choices, to remember that generosity misplaced could be mistaken for weakness. Marguerite understood the warning beneath the language. The city would tolerate eccentricity, but not disorder, and nothing threatened order more than blurred lines. Etienne noticed the tension before she spoke of it. He had learned long ago that danger announced itself not with noise but with patterns, changes in routine, eyes that followed rather than glanced, questions that pretended not to seek answers. He advised caution without presumption, suggesting she shorten their conversations, vary her routes. Let the garden return to being merely a garden. Marguerite heard the wisdom and felt the cost. To retreat now would be to accept that awareness itself was a transgression. She did not want courage, she wanted coherence, a life that did not require pretending not to see what she saw. The city, however, was tightening its grip. Rumors began to circulate, subtle at first. Whispers that the widow Duval was distracted, indulgent, insufficiently supervised. A visiting aunt remarked pointedly on the impropriety of a woman spending so much time outdoors unattended. A priest suggested additional confessions. Marguerite responded with composure, but inside her resolve hardened into something sharper. She began to move resources quietly, shifting funds, consulting maps, requesting copies of documents she had never before needed. Etienne recognized the signs of preparation and felt a familiar dread settle in his chest. He had seen plans fail, not because they were flawed, but because they were seen. When Marguerite asked him one evening whether vows spoken beyond the reach of Louisiana law could bind two people in truth, even if the city denied them, he answered with honesty stripped of illusion, vows could bind the heart, but the law bound bodies, property, and children. Anything done without the law's blessing would be vulnerable to erasure. Marguerite nodded, absorbing the risk without flinching. What she did not yet understand, and what Etienne feared, was that the greatest danger was not scandal, but exposure without protection. Their bond, still unnamed, was already being interpreted by others who needed no EV, dense to feel threatened. Lucien's visits grew more frequent, his tone more severe. He spoke openly now of arranging a suitable remarriage, of transferring certain assets for safekeeping, of appointing an overseer to relieve Marguerite of burdens she was clearly unprepared to manage alone. Marguerite refused with politeness sharpened by finality. The refusal landed like a challenge. Within days, she learned that her accounts were being reviewed by third parties, that questions had been raised about her capacity, that the garden staff had been reassigned without her consent. Etienne was ordered to work exclusively in the outer fields, a demotion framed as efficiency. The separation was sudden and deliberate, a reminder that proximity itself could be weaponized. Marguerite protested, citing productivity and expense, but the decision had already been made elsewhere. That night, alone in the house that no longer felt like hers, she realized that the city had chosen its side, and it was not hers. She sent for Etienne under cover of routine, a message passed quietly through hands she trusted less each day. When he arrived, the distance between them felt heavier than chains. They spoke not of feelings, but of logistics, of timelines and contingencies, of what could be done before the walls closed completely. Etienne urged restraint, reminding her that power, once threatened, did not negotiate. It crushed. Marguerite listened and then said something that startled them both. She would not live the rest of her life managed by fear. If the law refused to recognize her humanity when it conflicted with hierarchy, she would step beyond its reach. The decision did not feel romantic, it felt inevitable. Outside, the city continued its rituals, unaware that a line had been crossed not in the streets or courts, but in the quiet space where obedience had once lived. This was the moment when the story ceased to be about a widow's curiosity and became about defiance, when the garden stopped being a sanctuary and became a staging ground. What followed would test every assumption New Orleans held about ownership, marriage, and control, and it would provoke a response as swift as it was unforgiving. Because in a society built on the certainty of roles, nothing was more intolerable than a woman who chose, and nothing more dangerous than a bond that refused to remain invisible. By early autumn, the air in New Orleans took on a brittle edge, and with it came the unmistakable sense that decisions made in private were now being tallied in public ledgers. Marguerite felt the city closing ranks, not with shouts, but with procedures. Letters stamped and forwarded, committees convened under polite names, conversations that ended when she entered a room. The reassignment of Etienne to the outer fields had been only the first move, a test to see whether distance would dissolve what proximity had created. It did not. Instead, absence clarified the stakes. Marguerite discovered how quickly authority could be asserted over her affairs when she received notice that her estate required temporary oversight due to concerns raised about her judgment. The language was bloodless and precise, designed to sound protective while stripping control. Lucien Duval arrived the same afternoon, carrying sympathy like a warrant. He spoke of family obligation, of the danger of appearing erratic in a city that valued appearances as currency, of how easily rumors could be mistaken for evidence when a woman stood alone. Marguerite listened with the calm of someone who had already accepted that compliance would cost her more than resistance. She answered carefully, refusing concessions without provoking confrontation, buying time the way a chess player sacrifices a pawn to reposition the board. Meanwhile, she began to act with deliberation that bordered on invisibility. She instructed her lawyer, an aging man whose loyalty was more to precedent than to people, to prepare copies of her late who spans marriage settlements and land grants, documents that traced not just ownership, but intent. She requested maps of parish boundaries and shipping routes under the guise of exporting crops, and she sent discreet inquiries to acquaintances in Mobile and Havana about recognition of marriages performed beyond Louisiana jurisdiction. Each action alone appeared harmless. Together they formed a plan that could not yet be named aloud. Etienne, working farther from the house, felt the change in the air as acutely as Marguerite did. Overseers watched him more closely now, and instructions were delivered with a sharpness meant to remind him of place. Yet the demotion granted him something unexpected: access. The outer fields brought him into contact with dockworkers, teamsters, and sailors whose lives threaded through ports and borders. He listened more than he spoke, gathering fragments of information about papers that mattered and papers that didn't, about ports where questions were fewer and fees more negotiable, about captains who recognized humanity even when the law refused. When Marguerite managed to meet him again, briefly, at dusk, in a corridor of hedges that masked sound, what passed between them was not tenderness but alignment. They compared notes with the efficiency of people who understood that sentiment, while real could not be allowed to lead. Marguerite told him of the oversight notice and Lucien's intentions. Etienne told her of a schooner bound for Havana in 3 weeks, of a priest rumored to perform marriages without regard for color if the fee was paid in gold, of a legal gray space where recognition depended on distance and persistence. Neither of them spoke the word escape because neither intended to flee in the way the city expected. This was not flight, it was relocation of authority. The risk was immense. If discovered, Marguerite could be declared unfit and her estate seized. Etienne could be sold south, disappearing into a system designed to erase people without leaving records. The danger sharpened their focus rather than dulling it. They agreed on nothing that night except the necessity of discretion and the impossibility of retreat. As weeks passed, pressure increased. The committee overseeing Marguerite's affairs requested inventories, then audits. A cousin suggested she take in a chaperone for her own comfort. Invitations ceased. The priest's council grew more insistent. Marguerite responded with compliance where it cost little and resistance where it mattered, a balancing act that exhausted her but preserved momentum. She moved valuables quietly, jewelry transferred to a friend's keeping, cash converted to portable forms, while ensuring the estate appeared solvent and orderly. Etienne, for his part, arranged shifts to be present at the docks under legitimate pretexts, memorizing schedules and faces, learning which officials could be distracted and which could not. The city's gaze was not constant. It blinked, and in those blinks opportunity lived. Then came the incident that nearly ended everything. A servant, eager to curry favor, reported seeing Marguerite speak with Etienne after hours. The report traveled faster than truth ever did, and by the next morning, Lucien was at the house with two men Marguerite recognized from the courts. They questioned her gently, the way one handles glass, implying concern while documenting everything. Marguerite denied nothing that could be proven and admitted nothing that could not, presenting the encounter as a discussion of garden expenditures. The men nodded, wrote and left, satisfied enough for the moment. But the message was clear: time was no longer abundant. That night, Marguerite burned letters she had once cherished and copied passages from others she could not afford to lose. She slept little, rehearsing contingencies until dawn. When she saw Etienne again, this time by accident, crossing paths at a delivery, she read the urgency in his eyes before he spoke. The schooner's departure had been moved up. There would be no second chance. The plan condensed, shedding optional steps until only essentials remained. They would leave separately to avoid notice, converge at the docks under cover of commerce, and trust that preparation could compensate for luck. The night before departure, Marguerite walked through the house as if cataloguing it for memory, touching banisters and door frames, acknowledging the life she was leaving without mourning it. She dressed simply, disguising purpose as modesty. Etienne, in the fields, steadied himself with the knowledge that fear was not an enemy, but a signal to be precise. When they finally stood on the wharf amid the chaos of loading cargo, their eyes met without acknowledgement. Around them, New Orleans moved as it always had. Vendors shouting, sailors swearing, officials stamping papers, unaware that beneath the routine, a quiet rupture was forming. As the schooner pulled away, the city receded, not as a backdrop but as an idea, one that had demanded obedience and been denied. What lay ahead was uncertain and fraught, but it belonged to them in a way nothing before had. They did not know yet how far the city's reach extended, or how fiercely it would seek to reclaim what it considered stolen. They only knew that by choosing action over acquiescence, they had crossed from contemplation into consequence, and that whatever followed would test not just their resolve, but the very definitions of law, love, and legitimacy that New Orleans had guarded so jealously. The crossing altered time itself, stretching hours into something viscous and uncertain, and as the schooner cut through the gulf with its cargo of cotton bales and quiet intentions, Marguerite learned that freedom, even when chosen, does not arrive cleanly, but with splinters that lodge beneath the skin, because every creak of the hull reminded her that the law she had stepped outside of did not dissolve simply because water lay between her and New Orleans, and Etienne felt this truth as well, though he expressed it not in words, but in vigilance, positioning himself where he could watch the crew without being watched in return, listening for tonal shifts in conversation, for the subtle changes that signal curiosity, hardening into suspicion, and together they learned the discipline of appearing ordinary while carrying an extraordinary risk. A discipline sharpened when the captain announced an unscheduled stop at a small coastal inlet to take on supplies, a decision made casually but freighted with consequence, because ports are places where stories collide and paperwork becomes prophecy, and as the anchor dropped, Marguerite's mind raced through contingencies she had hoped to leave behind, calculating who might recognize her name, who might profit from selling it, and Etienne weighed the possibility that any delay increased the odds of recognition, because time favors systems, not fugitives, yet when officials boarded, their interest proved mercenary rather than moral, satisfied by fees and flattery, and the schooner was allowed to depart with its human secret intact, leaving behind only the echo of danger narrowly avoided. Days later, Havana rose from the sea like a promise edged with menace, its harbor dense with flags and languages that confused allegiance, and upon disembarking Marguerite felt the peculiar vulnerability of being both wealthy and unanchored, because money could open doors but not guarantee protection, while Etienne navigated the port with a fluency born of observation, reading the hierarchies encoded in posture and proximity, identifying who wielded power openly and who did so by indirection, and it was here that they encountered the first tangible cost of their plan, because recognition, even partial, carries a price, and the priest they sought demanded payment not only in gold but in silence, insisting on conditions that emphasized the provisional nature of his mercy. Agree. NG to perform the ceremony at dawn beyond the city's formal reach, with witnesses who would not remember names and records that would be kept only as long as discretion required, and Marguerite accepted these terms with a composure that belied the tremor beneath, understanding that legitimacy purchased in the shadows must still be defended in the light, while Etienne approached the matter with a clarity that surprised even him, recognizing that the ceremony was not an end but a foundation, one that would require constant reinforcement against erosion by law and custom. The marriage itself unfolded without spectacle, a brief exchange of vows that felt both insufficient and monumental, binding them in a way that no ledger could fully capture. And, as the sun rose, Marguerite experienced a rush of relief so sharp it bordered on grief, because what she had feared losing was now irrevocably altered. And Etienne felt the weight of a new identity settle not as a burden, but as a responsibility, one that demanded vigilance equal to desire. Their return north was impossible. Instead, they moved inland, adopting a life of deliberate modesty in a town that traded in anonymity as much as sugar, where Marguerite learned to inhabit a smaller self without surrendering agency, and Etienne negotiated work that leveraged his knowledge while minimizing exposure, and for a time the world seemed content to let them exist in its margins until letters began to arrive, forwarded through intermediaries with careful phrasing that suggested both pursuit and restraint, as Lucien and others attempted to reconcile outrage with pragmatism, because scandal, when stretched too thin, can dissolve into inconvenience, and the question became not whether Marguerite had defied them, but how loudly they wished to announce it. The legal maneuvering that followed unfolded slowly, as all durable threats do, with challenges filed in Louisiana courts asserting fraud, coercion, and incapacity, arguments designed less to win outright than to create a fog through which assets could be seized or frozen, and Marguerite responded with documentation that emphasized continuity and competence, producing records that demonstrated her consistent management and intent, while Etienne's status was attacked obliquely, framed as evidence of undue influence rather than as a personhood the courts were unwilling to acknowledge. And this tactic revealed the system's preference for abstraction over confrontation, because it could deny him without naming him, and the strain of this prolonged uncertainty tested their resolve in ways the initial flight had not, as each delay carried financial and emotional costs that compounded, forcing choices about what to defend and what to relinquish. Yet amid this attrition, unexpected allies emerged, drawn less by sympathy than by opportunity, merchants who recognized Marguerite's acumen and Etienne's insight, offering partnerships that provided income streams insulated from Louisiana's reach, and through these arrangements they constructed a life that, while precarious, possessed a resilience born of diversification, and as months turned into years, the initial scandal receded from headlines, even as it persisted in correspondence, becoming a problem to be managed rather than a crisis to be avenged. Still, the past refused to remain dormant entirely, because when Marguerite fell ill during a particularly brutal summer, rumors surged anew, fueled by the possibility that her death might reopen the question of inheritance, and Lucien's letters sharpened, invoking duty with renewed fervor, and Etienne confronted the fear he had long postponed, that love forged under pressure must endure not only opposition but the ordinary cruelty of time, and when Marguerite recovered, thinner but resolute, they addressed this vulnerability with the same pragmatism that had guided them from the start, drafting wills recognized in multiple jurisdictions, dispersing assets, and modifying protections that acknowledged the likelihood of challenge, turning contingency into policy. In doing so, they transformed their relationship from a provocation into a practice, one that required constant tending and adaptation, and as the world adjusted around them, absorbing their defiance without fully endorsing it, they came to understand that victory in such a society was not measured by applause or absolution, but by endurance, by the capacity to persist without permission, and though they could never be certain that the reach of New Orleans would not extend again, they had learned to live within uncertainty without being consumed by it, forging a quiet legitimacy that existed not because it was sanctioned, but because it was sustained, and in this persistence lay the truest challenge to the order they had defied, an assertion that life, once chosen, could be lived on terms negotiated rather than dictated, even when the cost of that choice remained ongoing and the outcome perpetually unfinished. What followed was not a climax but a grinding season in which legitimacy had to be defended daily against erosion, because once the immediate scandal faded, it was replaced by something more dangerous, normalization that invited quiet undoing, and Marguerite and Etienne learned that systems rarely attack what they can simply outlast, so the months after their legal fortifications became a study in attrition, as Louisiana courts stalled without dismissing, correspondence arrived just often enough to remind them of unresolved claims, and intermediaries hinted that a reasonable settlement might still be reached if Marguerite were willing to concede partial control, suggestions framed as mercy rather than coercion, and it was during this time that the emotional cost of resistance surfaced most sharply, because endurance demanded a discipline that left little room for grief, and Marguerite sometimes found herself mourning not the life she had left behind, but the version of herself that had once believed clarity alone could secure peace, while Etienne, carrying the compounded burden of visibility and vulnerability, became acutely aware that every public success sharpened private risk, because competence in a man like him still provoked scrutiny in a world invested in his diminishment. Their household adapted accordingly, shrinking its footprint, rotating trusted staff, and maintaining a rhythm of modest prosperity that avoided conspicuous peaks, yet even restraint could not fully shield them from the slow creep of rumor, which re-emerged in new forms as traders whispered of the widow's husband, with a curiosity that oscillated between admiration and threat, and these murmurs reached Louisiana in distorted echoes that reignited Thomas and Lucien's efforts, culminating in a renewed petition that challenged not the marriage itself, but the transfer of assets made afterward, arguing that any decisions Marguerite had taken since leaving New Orleans were tainted by foreign influence, a phrase chosen precisely because it could be stretched to encompass geography, race, and gender without naming any directly. The hearing that followed, conducted largely through depositions and written arguments, exposed the cruelty of distance, because Marguerite could not appear without risking arrest under spurious claims, and Etienne's testimony, carefully prepared, was accepted only in fragments, redacted to preserve the court's comfort, and as weeks passed, the strain manifested physically in Marguerite's recurring fevers and Etienne's sleepless vigilance, and it became clear that legal victory, even partial, would not restore what this prolonged contest had consumed. Yet amid this fatigue, an unexpected development altered the calculus, as a merchant house with interests spanning the Gulf proposed a restructuring that would place a significant portion of Marguerite's holdings beyond Louisiana's jurisdiction in exchange for favorable terms, an AR arrangement that promised insulation at the cost of autonomy, and the decision forced Marguerite to confront the limits of resistance, because every safeguard required compromise, and choosing which compromises preserved the core of their life together became the central question. After days of deliberation marked by careful accounting and honest conversation, they agreed to the restructuring, not as capitulation, but as adaptation, recognizing that survival within hostile systems often depends on selective disengagement rather than total opposition, and when the agreement was finalized, the immediate pressure eased, letters slowed, and the sense of being hunted receded into a distant vigilance that allowed space for something almost resembling normalcy. In that space, they began to imagine a future not defined solely by defense, investing in education initiatives that quietly supported free black communities, funding ventures that created employment insulated from plantation hierarchies, and cultivating relationships that were reciprocal rather than transactional, and through these acts, they reoriented their lives from reaction to intention, discovering that agency, once reclaimed, could be multiplied through stewardship rather than hoarded in fear. Still, the past asserted itself at moments least expected, as when news arrived of a sudden illness in New Orleans that claimed Thomas's health and softened Lucien's tone, introducing the possibility of reconciliation not as forgiveness, but as exhaustion. And Marguerite felt a complicated stirring at this turn, because the prospect of closure, however partial, carried with it the danger of reopening wounds she had worked so hard to cauterize. And after much consideration, she declined overtures that would have required her presence, choosing instead to communicate through counsel with a firmness that acknowledged history without submitting to it. Etienne supported this decision with a quiet certainty born of experience, understanding that some doors, once closed to survive, should not be reopened for sentiment alone. And as time passed, the legal threats dwindled into archival residue, present but inert, and the life they had constructed gained a durability that surprised them both, not because opposition vanished, but because it lost urgency, becoming one factor among many rather than the defining condition. In reflecting on this evolution, Marguerite recognized that the true transformation had not been legal or geographic, but internal, a recalibration of what legitimacy meant when stripped of public approval, and Etienne articulated this insight with a simplicity that grounded it, that a life sustained in truth, even under constraint, exerted a quiet pressure on falsehood simply by continuing, and as they moved forward, aware that history might never fully record their choices with fairness, they committed to living as if record were less important than impact, understanding that endurance itself could be a form of testimony, and in this commitment lay a peace that was neither naive nor complete, but sufficient, forged not in the absence of threat, but in the practiced refusal to let threat dictate the terms of existence, a refusal that had carried them from secrecy to sustenance, from defiance to durability, and into a future still uncertain but undeniably their own. By the time the renewed legal pressure subsided into what could only be described as a tense stalemate, Marguerite and Etienne found themselves standing at an unfamiliar threshold where danger no longer announced itself loudly, but instead lingered in the background like a damp climate, shaping every choice through anticipation rather than reaction, and this was the phase neither of them had been prepared for, because endurance after crisis requires a different discipline than survival during it, demanding patience without the adrenaline of emergency, and so their days took on a quieter structure that concealed constant sea calculation beneath its calm surface, as Marguerite reviewed correspondence with the care of a chess player studying endgames, measuring not only what was written, but what was omitted, while Etienne refined the outward simplicity of their household operations, knowing that invisibility, once achieved, had to be actively maintained lest it collapse under its own complacency. The social world around them continued to turn, indifferent yet watchful, and they learned that absence did not equate to freedom, because even distance could be weaponized through rumor, as fragments of their story resurfaced in ports and salons, distorted just enough to remain useful, and these echoes reminded them that the story others told about them would never align with the truth they lived, a realization that slowly stripped Marguerite of her remaining attachment to reputation, replacing it with a more pragmatic concern for consequence, while Etienne, ever aware of how narratives adhere unevenly to bodies, became adept at disarming curiosity with competence, allowing others to underestimate him in ways that paradoxically granted him greater operational freedom. It was during this period that Marguerite began to redirect her energies inward, not in retreat, but in consolidation, commissioning detailed inventories of her assets and obligations, untangling the last threads of New Orleans influence that remained embedded in contracts she had once signed without imagining how they could later be used against her, and this work, painstaking and unglamorous, proved to be one of the most consequential acts of defiance she had undertaken, because it shifted her relationship to power from inherited entitlement to deliberate stewardship, and Etienne recognized in this transformation something deeply resonant, as it mirrored his own long journey from imposed identity toward self-authorship. Together, they cultivated a circle of allies defined less by proximity than by shared discretion, individuals who understood that trust, in their world, was a practice rather than a declaration, and through these relationships they began to engage in acts that extended beyond self-preservation quietly supporting networks that facilitated education, trade, and legal literacy among free black communities, not as benefactors seeking absolution, but as participants in an ecosystem of mutual resilience. And this shift marked a subtle but profound change in their orientation, because for the first time since leaving New Orleans, their actions were not solely reactive to threat, but generative of possibility. Yet even as they built outward, the past asserted itself inwardly, especially for Marguerite, who found that memory did not recede in proportion to distance, and she began to experience moments of reckoning that arrived unbidden, triggered by mundane details, a ledger margin, a familiar turn of phrase, the cadence of a hymn, that summoned the weight of choices she could neither undo nor fully reconcile. And in these moments, Etienne's presence became not a remedy but a witness, offering neither absolution nor condemnation, only the steady acknowledgement that survival often carries with it a residue that cannot be washed away by intention alone. Their conversations during these times deepened into a shared language of accountability, one that resisted the simplifications imposed by both condemnation and romanticization, and in this honesty they found a form of intimacy that did not rely on secrecy, but on sustained clarity, an intimacy forged through the mutual recognition that love, when entangled with history, must be actively disentangled from domination to remain credible. The world beyond their household continued to shift as well, with economic fluctuations and political murmurs signaling an approaching instability that neither of them could name precisely but both sensed intuitively, and this awareness prompted further adaptation as Marguerite diversified investments into Vent. Ure is less vulnerable to plantation economics, while Etienne leveraged his growing reputation for reliability to secure partnerships that operated across jurisdictions, thereby creating redundancies that functioned as safeguards against sudden reversals. It was in this strategic expansion that Etienne encountered a new form of resistance, subtler but no less insidious, as his increasing visibility provoked a recalibration of how others engaged with him, oscillating between tokenization and quiet obstruction, and navigating this terrain required a deftness that exacted its own toll, because every success demanded an explanation that reaffirmed the comfort of those who benefited from the illusion of hierarchy, and yet he persisted, not out of naivete, but out of a refusal to allow the boundaries of his participation to be dictated by others' fear. Marguerite observed this with a mixture of pride and apprehension, acutely aware that the more Etienne asserted his place within these networks, the more he challenged assumptions that had previously shielded them through underestimation, and this tension surfaced in moments of disagreement that tested their ability to hold divergent risk tolerances without fracturing trust, disagreements resolved not through dominance, but through negotiation that acknowledged the asymmetry of their exposure. As months stretched into years, the legal threats that had once defined their existence faded into bureaucratic inertia, still present but increasingly unlikely to mobilize with the force necessary to undo what had been established, and this gradual easing allowed for a recalibration of time itself as they began to imagine futures measured not in defensive milestones but in sustained contribution, a shift that brought with it both relief and responsibility, because with survival secured, the question of purpose re-emerged with renewed urgency. They responded to this question not with grand declarations, but with cumulative choices, each one reinforcing the life they were building rather than the one they had fled, and in doing so they discovered that the most radical outcome of their defiance was not the preservation of wealth or status, but the redefinition of legitimacy on their own terms, a legitimacy grounded in continuity rather than approval, and as they moved through this quieter chapter, aware that stability itself could be temporary, they embraced the discipline of vigilance without surrendering to it, cultivating a form of endurance that was neither brittle nor complacent, but adaptive, reflective, and deeply rooted in the shared understanding that while the systems that had shaped their past remained largely intact, they had carved out a space within them that operated according to a different logic, one that prioritized agency over appearance, accountability over absolution, and presence over permission, and it was within this space forged through sustained effort rather than singular triumph that they found a measure of peace sufficient to sustain them through whatever uncertainties lay ahead, knowing that while history might yet intrude, they had learned how to meet it without relinquishing the integrity of the life they had chosen to build together. As the fragile equilibrium they had constructed settled into something resembling permanence, the consequences of their earlier defiance began to surface in more complex and less predictable ways, because stability, once achieved, has a way of inviting scrutiny from forces that had previously dismissed them as anomalies destined to collapse. And it was during this phase that Marguerite and Etienne confronted the most difficult reckoning of all, not with courts or relatives or gossip, but with the deeper moral residue of a world that could not be escaped simply by crossing borders or rewriting contracts. For even as they lived beyond the immediate reach of New Orleans law, the legal and psychological architecture of slavery remained embedded. In every exchange, every document, every expectation that followed Etienne's presence into rooms that had never been built to accommodate him as an equal. Marguerite felt this tension acutely, as she became increasingly aware that her wealth, no matter how carefully repurposed, still carried the imprint of a system that had granted her power by default, and this realization began to unsettle her in ways that no courtroom accusation ever had, prompting long nights of reflection during which she revisited the memories she had once suppressed, moments of passive compliance, of choices deferred, of silences that now felt louder than any spoken cruelty, and she understood with painful clarity that while love had propelled her to defy her family, it had not absolved her of the responsibility to confront the broader implications of her past, a responsibility that could not be fulfilled through symbolic gestures alone. Etienne, observing this internal struggle, recognized its necessity even as he resisted becoming its instrument, because he had spent too many years existing as a moral ledger for others, and he was determined that their relationship would not replicate that dynamic under a different name, and so their conversations during this period were marked by an honesty that sometimes bordered on discomfort, as they navigated the fine line between shared accountability and individual agency, acknowledging that while their lives were intertwined, their reckonings were not interchangeable. It was through these exchanges that they began to articulate a vision for their future that extended beyond personal survival or even mutual fulfillment, one that grappled with the question of what it meant to live ethically within a system that offered no clean exits, and this inquiry led them toward actions that were deliberately incremental rather than performative, such as funding legal defenses for those targeted by discriminatory ordinances, supporting literacy initiatives that operated quietly beneath the notice of authorities, and investing in enterprises that prioritized autonomy over profit, not as acts of redemption but as commitments to redistribution that recognized harm without attempting to erase it. These efforts, however, did not go unnoticed, and as their influence grew subtly but steadily, so too did the attention of those who viewed such autonomy as a threat, particularly local power brokers who understood that the erosion of hierarchy often begins not with rebellion but with competence, and it was within this climate of cautious expansion that Etienne encountered a renewed form of hostility, one that cloaked itself in bureaucratic skepticism rather than overt violence, as permits were delayed, partnerships questioned, and his credibility subjected to standards of proof that were never demanded of others. Marguerite, watching these patterns re-emerge, was struck by the realization that distance had altered the shape of oppression, but not its substance, and this awareness fueled a renewed determination to leverage her remaining social capital, not as a shield, but as a lever, intervening strategically in ways that disrupted the narratives used to marginalize Etienne without positioning herself as his savior, a balance that required constant recalibration and mutual consent. Their partnership during this time evolved into something more explicitly political, though never ideological in the abstract sense, grounded instead in lived experience and practical response, and this evolution brought with it moments of strain, particularly when their assessments of risk diverged, as Etienne grew increasingly confident in his ability to navigate hostile terrain through skill and reputation, while Marguerite, attuned to the capriciousness of power, urged caution born of familiarity with how quickly tolerance could curdle into reprisal. These tensions did not fracture them, but they did demand a deeper articulation of trust, one that acknowledged not only shared goals but differing vulnerabilities, and it was through this process that they arrived at a more nuanced understanding of partnership, one that resisted the illusion of symmetry while refusing to accept inevitability as an excuse for inaction. As the years advanced and broader political currents began to shift ominously, signaling an approaching period of upheaval that neither could fully anticipate, but both sensed with growing urgency, they faced the sobering possibility that the relative autonomy they had secured might prove temporary, subject to reversal by forces far beyond their influence, and this prospect prompted difficult conversations about contingency, legacy, and the measures they would take to protect not only themselves, but the networks they had helped sustain should conditions deteriorate. It was during these deliberations that Marguerite made one of the most consequential decisions of her life, initiating a gradual transfer of authority and resources into structures that could outlast her, relinquishing direct control in favor of collective governance, a move that marked a definitive break from the model of ownership that had once defined her identity and which, though imperfect, represented a tangible step toward dismantling the logic that had shaped her world. Etienne supported this transition with measured optimism, aware that decentralization carried its own risks, but convinced that the alternative, clinging to control out of fear, would only replicate the very patterns they sought to escape. And together they approached this reconfiguration with a seriousness that reflected their understanding of its stakes, recognizing that while no arrangement could fully insulate against injustice, intentional design could at least mitigate its most predictable harms. As their focus shifted increasingly toward stewardship rather than defense, they experienced a subtle but profound change in their daily lives, one characterized by a quieter confidence and a deeper sense of alignment between intention and action. And yet this tranquility was tempered by the knowledge that history is rarely linear, that progress often provokes backlash, and that the freedoms they enjoyed existed within a precarious margin. Still, they chose to inhabit this uncertainty without retreat, embracing a form of vigilance that did not eclipse their humanity, and in doing so they demonstrated that resistance need not always announce itself through confrontation, that it can also reside in persistence, in the refusal to relinquish complexity for comfort, and in the ongoing effort to live deliberately within constraint. By the end of this chapter, as they stood on the threshold of an era whose contours were only beginning to emerge, Marguerite and Etienne had come to understand that their story, whatever its ultimate outcome, was not defined by a single act of defiance or a singular victory over those who opposed them, but by the accumulation of choices made in full awareness of their limitations, choices that prioritized integrity over absolution and continuity over spectacle, and it was this understanding that would shape the decisions yet to come, decisions that would test the durability of what they had built and reveal whether the foundations they had laid could withstand the storms gathering just beyond the horizon. As the final phase of their journey unfolded, it did so not with the dramatic rupture that stories often promise, but with a slow, inexorable tightening of the world around them, a narrowing of possibilities shaped by forces neither Marguerite nor Etienne could command, only anticipate and prepare for, because by the late 1840s, the political and social climate across Louisiana and beyond had begun to harden in ways that made quiet autonomy increasingly suspect, and the tolerance that once allowed them to exist in the margins of legality was replaced by a sharpened insistence on classification, documentation, and obedi. Hence, as lawmakers, planters, and financiers alike moved to reinforce boundaries they feared were eroding, rumors of new statutes traveled faster than the laws themselves, and whispers of enforcement preceded official notices, creating an atmosphere of preemptive compliance in which even those who had once turned a blind eye now felt compelled to scrutinize, question, and report. And it was within this environment that Marguerite and Etienne made the deliberate choice to shift from expansion to consolidation, recognizing that survival would depend not on visibility or growth, but on resilience and dispersal. They quietly finalized arrangements that transferred remaining assets into trusts managed by individuals whose interests aligned with long-term continuity rather than personal gain, embedding safeguards that would make sudden seizure or reversal more difficult, though never impossible, and in doing so Marguerite accepted a form of diminishment that was both material and symbolic, relinquishing the last vestiges of an identity rooted in ownership in favor of one defined by custodianship, a transformation that brought with it a strange mix of grief and relief. Etienne, meanwhile, turned his attention toward mentorship, investing his time and knowledge into preparing others to navigate the hostile terrain he knew all too well, understanding that his greatest contribution at this stage was not resistance in isolation, but the cultivation of capacity in those who would outlast him, and this quiet labor became his way of asserting continuity against a system designed to fragment and erase. Their personal relationship, shaped by years of shared risk and negotiation, evolved into something steadier and less combustible, anchored not in secrecy or defiance, but in a mutual recognition of limits, and while the intensity of their early bond softened, it was replaced by a depth that did not require constant validation, a companionship forged through endurance rather than rebellion. Yet even as they settled into this more measured rhythm, the specter of interference loomed ever closer, manifesting first in subtle inquiries and later in more explicit demands, as officials began to question the legitimacy of arrangements that defied easy categorization, and it was during one such inquiry that Marguerite confronted the inevitability she had long postponed, that her name, her history, and her remaining influence could no longer shield them indefinitely. Rather than wait for this scrutiny to crystallize into formal action, she initiated the final contingency they had discussed in abstract but never fully embraced, arranging for Etienne to leave Louisiana altogether under circumstances that would draw minimal attention, a decision that was both pragmatic and devastating, because it acknowledged that proximity, once their source of strength, had become their greatest vulnerability. The departure was planned with meticulous care, executed without ceremony, and marked by a restraint that belied its emotional weight, as they chose not to dramatize what they both understood as a necessary fracture rather than a failure, and when Etienne finally crossed the threshold into a future defined by uncertainty but unburdened by constant surveillance, he carried with him not only the skills and relationships he had cultivated, but the quiet certainty that what they had built together, though altered, would persist in forms neither could fully trace. Marguerite remained behind, her presence serving as both anchor and decoy, absorbing the attention that might otherwise have followed him, and in the months that followed, she navigated the tightening constraints with a composure that masked the cost of her solitude, responding to inquiries with measured compliance, conceding where necessary, and preserving what she could without provoking escalation. Her health began to decline during this period, a gradual diminishment that mirrored the contraction of her world, and as she retreated from public life, she devoted her remaining energy to ensuring that the structures she had set in motion would continue to function without her intervention, reviewing documents, reaffirming trusts, and recording instructions that emphasized discretion, adaptability, and collective decision-making over rigid adherence to precedent. When her death eventually came, it did so quietly, devoid of the scandal her family once feared, and the settlement of her affairs unfolded without public spectacle, precisely because the mechanisms she had established resisted simplification, dispersing authority in ways that frustrated attempts at consolidation or reversal. Etienne learned of her passing through indirect channels, the news arriving without context or ceremony, and while the distance between them rendered mourning a solitary act, it also underscored the success of their final strategy, that their connection, though no longer visible, had not been severed by exposure or betrayal. In the years that followed, fragments of their story surfaced intermittently in altered forms, anonymized references in legal records, whispered recollections among those who had benefited from their efforts, and faint traces in enterprises whose origins were deliberately obscured. And while no single narrative captured the full complexity of what they had endured or achieved, the cumulative effect of these fragments constituted a quiet rebuttal to the assumption that all such stories must end in erasure or catastrophe. Their legacy did not reside in monuments or proclamations, but in the continued existence of spaces where autonomy was practiced rather than declared, where power was negotiated rather than imposed, and where the rigid hierarchies of their time were subtly but persistently undermined by competence, collaboration, and foresight. By the time broader upheavals swept across the region, reshaping its legal and social landscape in ways neither Marguerite nor Etienne could have fully predicted, the foundations they had laid had already adapted, absorbed, and redirected those forces, ensuring that their impact endured not as a cautionary tale or a romantic anomaly, but as a testament to the possibilities that emerge when individuals choose intention over inevitability. And so, as this story draws to a close, it does so not with a definitive resolution, but with an open horizon, inviting reflection rather than judgment, because the true significance of what Marguerite and Etienne dared to do lies not in whether their choices conform to moral absolutes, but in the fact that they refuse to accept the limits imposed upon them as final, carving out meaning within constraint and leaving behind a legacy that challenges us to reconsider how power, love, and agency intersect in the shadows of history. If this story made you pause, question, or see the past differently, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you never miss a hidden chapter of history, and leave a comment sharing how deeply this story affected you, because these stories only survive when they are remembered and spoken aloud.